All right. Hello and welcome to When and Where to Trench. I'm Belthacabra. My pronouns are he and him, and I'm hoping that this one's going to be much more of a practical guide, particularly given that we're in the early stages of war currently. So let's get straight into it, right? Where are you going to want to dig a trench? There are two primary answers to this question. One is you're going to dig that trench around a base, whether that is a bunker base, a relic base, a town hall. You're going to have some sort of a fixed spawn point or other objective that you're attempting to protect with your trench and fully encircle with them, or you're going to wind up building them along roads. Um, Realistically, the reason why you're going to wind up building them along roads and not in the middle of, say, like a field is because the roads are the most likely way that everything is going to get moved, whether that is logistical supplies, tanks, soldiers spawning back in, right? Even if you're trying to fight a field battle with an enemy, and it might make a lot of sense to go around, the most efficient way to deliver troops to that new front line is going to be by truck, carrying, 5 soldiers at a time, and those trucks are going to want to move down the road. So we're going to start assuming that you're fighting over either a base or a road, and then we'll develop from there. And in particular, right, I'm going to make the argument that we're going to just abandon trenches around bases for right now. This isn't going to be like a permanent thing, but um, frankly, building trenches that interact effectively with bunker bases and other buildings is very difficult, and it's something that I don't think is currently important. Um, the folks who are building bunkers are going to be able to handle protecting those bases just fine, and there are considerations that make trenches a little bit weaker for this purpose. And in addition, when we go to trench for road fights and fighting in the field, we have a huge advantage in that there are no bases out there. That's sort of the assumption. The thing that distinguishes whether or not you're fighting around a bunker base in a field and fighting in a field is whether or not the bunker base is there. So let's assume we're just gonna ditch the bunker base idea. Um, these trenches are going to be particularly effective for us to get deployed during the early war. I'm defining the early war as anything prior to the use of tanks and anti-tank weaponry, right? Um, this is a great time for us to start trenching because we don't have to worry about digging trenches that might screw over friendly tanks, right? A lot of times, one of the biggest things that you can mess up about digging trenches in a field fight is putting something down that the enemy is then able to occupy and use to deliver anti-tank weapons in order to destroy your friendly tanks. We don't have to worry about that for some time in this war, so I think it's a great time for us to start digging. Um, we have some other considerations, right? Early war, there's just less high explosive floating around in order to just shell the crap out of us and drive us out of these trenches, so they're going to be a lot more resilient. Um, and because there is a greater need to carry high explosives by hand in the form of mammons, it becomes a lot more important for us to protect infantry, particularly as they move down roads, because um, there's going to be a lot of guys who are carrying mammons. We can't afford for them to get shot at. They're not as good at fighting for themselves. Um, and the more of them that can make it down the road to the target, the more boom we can get on the enemy base, which this is essentially what my slide here is. I've talked a bit ahead of myself, but you know, going back to that theory presentation on the theory of soldiering, right? If infantry's purpose is to, at this stage in the war, when there are no other more advanced forms of HE, deliver that high explosive damage to the enemy structures, and they have to carry it by hand, the single most important thing we can do is make sure that as many of them as possible live to get there. We know that the way that our troops will wind up dying or suffering attrition on the way to the destination is that they're going to be shot by enemy small arms fire um, through the enemy zones of control, and we know that trenches are a fantastic way to enter into an enemy zone of control and then kill them without exposing yourself to being shot back at, right? So let's get to the practical matter, right? In this image here, you can see I've got a simulated road here with these two trenches. Uh, Here's Jen. She's doing pretty good since the last video. Uh, and what I'm going to recommend first is that we take these minimally viable trenches, right? If you remember, that's a trench, staircase, like a straight trench, staircase on either end, barbed wire on the front, sandbags on the back. Real simple stuff. And we're going to do what I'm currently calling fishboning. Laugh at me if you want, right? But the general idea is we're going to try and stack these things just down the road. One on the left, one on the right, one on the left, one on the right. Um, and we're going to keep it really simple. How far apart should they be? About far enough for you to be able to shoot people sitting at the entrance of the next one from the previous one. So when you're digging these things, maybe keep a rifle with you, keep it a little bit loaded, and you can just aim, see how far that rifle will shoot. That's where you put the next one, right? We're going to keep them at 45-degree angles to the road. The intent here is that as our soldiers are walking down this road, right, it's a lot faster for them to be able to just see into these trenches, left, right, to see whether or not there's any enemies in them. And that ability to make a quick visual confirmation of whether or not the trench is clear is going to be really important to keeping people alive and keeping them quickly moving down the road, which is what we want. We don't want them to be tied up having to clear these things too much. So, why are we going for the minimally viable trench instead of something more? Um, they're really fast to build, right? Having an absolute ton of these going the whole way down the road means that we always have quick and available cover. Like I said, we can visually clear them, um, and being able to fire on the next trench's entrance from the previous one means that we can make sure that enemies who occupy the next trench up are forced to retreat further into that trench, which makes them vulnerable to getting pushed from behind the sandbags. And we can do that without suffering many losses because it's, you know, the distance from them to the entrance of the previous trench is further a little bit, maybe, than the distance, from that trench to where they're sitting. And hopefully, it's okay if you don't get these ranges just right. It's okay if your rifles aren't quite long enough range. The point is quick access to cover and a means of menacing the people out of the next trench, right? So let's talk about issues that we have here, right? You can see this trench is only going to be, if we were to draw that sort of zone of control, right? The fire angles, this thing can only really threaten the road, right? It's got a staircase over on this side, which means that it doesn't provide much cover from enemies on this side. So enemies, like if we imagine the enemy is all this whole upper area, we can fight some of them, but not all of them. And certainly enemies coming in from the side, right, over by where Jen's standing, we're going to be really weak because we're going to have sandbags along here. We may not even see them flanking us, right? So let's expand on the plan, right? This is, again, very quick, very simple trench to dig, right? These straight pieces are our preferred pieces because they get dug faster than the connector pieces and they can still have staircases in them, right? We're trying to maintain our good habits here. Two staircases, right? So we have two different ways to escape from grenades in case they come in. We've got sandbags still covering. They're going to be along this portion here and this line, meaning that we're going to have kind of this whole back area to play around with, right? Technically, enemies can stand at either of the staircase entrances and get a little bit of cover, but, we've got good options for approaching them from a very large area behind us, right? This addition up here, right, it's going to be barbed wire all along this front side, right? Which means that we're going to have a little pocket in here that's going to have, good cover from most angles that the enemy might approach from, with like the back wall cover, right? The good stuff. Um, they're going to be able to hit most of the enemies out here. We've got a nice line for if enemies are pushing from this side. We've got a nice line if the enemies are pushing from this side, right? We're still a little bit weak from enemies flanking, like over here, but we're getting a little bit stronger and at the cost of just one more trench. And frankly, you put down one trench, one sandbag, right? And then you can barbed wire this thing in your own time. The other nice thing is you can dig this second trench from this first one. With the staircase here, it's going to be a little bit worse because you're going to be a little bit more exposed while you're digging it, but you can still use some of that cover, right? to help you advance this thing if you need to do it under fire. So let's keep going even more, right? So we kept saying that there was this problem of like when it was just these two trenches, we still had an issue of what if enemies kind of just sweep in with a little flanking maneuver right like this, right? It's going to deny us a lot of the cover. If Jen's standing in here, she's not going to really be as effective at fighting enemies who maybe came wide and then in from the side like this, right? So let's make that really inconvenient for the enemy. Sure, they can still kind of do that to this setup, but if we say we're going to have sandbags along here, sandbags here, here, and down along here, the enemy has to go, right? No longer can they just come down slightly out of kilter from the road. They have to go way out into the field and then even further, right? Way, way out into the field before they can get around this thing. Um, and we've doubled the amount of time that we're sitting here digging this trench, so we have to be careful about that, right? Um, but we've essentially like with just four straight piece trenches, and then maybe like you could honestly even cancel the sandbags on these two sides. You could just do three, four, and three more over here for seven. One, two, three staircases, right? Plenty of options for getting out. Barbed wire the rest of it in your own time, and this is going to be a really solid place to protect, to like advance on from our troops, and to defend against enemy pushes. I've got a note here. Remember to never build a trench that looks backwards. This is because, as I've been talking about this, right? Been talking about worrying about enemies flanking you. The temptation may be, hey, rather than just continue to stick this leg out, what if I like put a connector trench in here and bent this downwards, or hell, even bent it backwards, right? Never, ever dig a trench that looks backwards. If you dig a trench that was down here, flat at the bottom, you know which side you'd sandbag? You'd sandbag the outside, barbed wire the inside, which means that it's not going to help you against troops who are flanking you because they're just going to get behind the sandbags and kill you. Um, so here's kind of an example of this. Imagine you're partway through building that one on the last slide, right? Um, and you get to this step and you say, you know what? I want to stop here, right? And what you might be tempted to do is say, I'm going to barbed wire along here, up around here, around the outside, and then I'm going to barbed wire this back bit. And that way, I can fight enemies even like if enemies are flanking, they're coming around and around and around and around and around. They're going to have to get like the whole way over to here, right? Before they can finally have some sort of an advantage over me. You may think that that's great, but here's the problem. Imagine, you know, Jen and some buddies are in here defending this, and people start throwing gas grenades at them, right? Boom, boom, boom. Two, three gas grenades go in. Uh, she's forced out of this area. The enemy moves in. They get into here, run down to here, and now they're holding this, right? The safe angles to walk up from this side towards this trench has now been cut down to like only over here. You have to essentially come from the road and up onto this. And maybe you say, oh, that's not so bad, but it is a lot worse than if you just put sandbags along this. And the thing that you're kind of gaining in exchange for that is if the enemy were to pull an insane flank and I was standing over here waiting for them, I could kill them. It's it's just not worth what you're giving up in a strategic sense. It's better to stick that fourth piece on, right? Make their job kind of inconvenient, um, but don't make it a nightmare for us to have to retake this trench, right? Um, so let's talk about this idea of the pocket, right? You remember on that last one, we were slowly building out this concept. We started with a minimal trench, we went with the side piece, we connected another one, and then another one, and what we're building is this like triangle wall where enemies can't walk through. As we said, they can go these long ways around it, but it creates a zone behind it that I'm calling a pocket, right? Pocket is essentially an area that is um, protected passively by the trench. Because of the way that the barbed wire is, because of the way the sandbags are, enemies aren't going to be easily able to get into the trench. Once they're in it, they're going to want to get out of the trench, right? And that pocket area has nothing else in it, meaning that the enemies are going to want to leave it. They're going to want to go somewhere else. Um, and this means that we're unlikely, even though there's nothing, even though in that triangle there's nothing in that area to stop enemies from standing there, they're unlikely to want to stand there, and they're unlikely to get there. If they're just, even if they've overwhelmed the trench and there's nobody in it, they're going to go around it and then probably just keep going down the road, or probably just keep going down the field, right? Additionally, while that trench is occupied, um, presumably enemies would have to pass deep into our zones of control and then stand there waiting for their accuracy to build up before they'd be able to shoot anyone in the pocket. Meaning that the pocket is like, that's the safe zone. That's where, you know, if you need to pull up a crane in order to deploy an emplacement, if you need medics to be operating, if you need anything that's going to be a little bit more vulnerable, that's the place to be. The downside is the pocket is the side that has all of our sandbags on it, right? If an enemy were to get in there, they'd be able to clear our trenches and kill all of us pretty easily, right? The point of the sandbags is to make it so that anybody who's in that area can easily regain control of the trenches. So it's critically important that enemies not get into the pocket, which is why you might start thinking, well, what if I just built some backwards facing trenches, right? Really make sure that that pocket's secure. And again, it's the problem of if we were ever to be driven out of the pocket and the enemies occupied it, those backward facing trenches immediately become a problem for us, right? It's much better for us to say we're going to try and make these pockets, but we're always going to leave them open to attack. We're just going to try and point the area where that attack would have to come from towards where our friendly soldiers are going to be coming from, right? Because the odds are, if it's mostly friendly soldiers are going to come from there, maybe somebody's going to slip by, maybe somebody's going to punch through, but the worst thing that's going to happen is they'll clear us out of this trench for right now, and then we'll be back, right? So think about creating those pockets while you're trenching, and think about the fact that you can never truly secure them. You're just going to hope that the reinforcements coming towards where you are will prevent people from getting around them. And then you can, try and make it harder to get around your trench in order to make it more likely that they'll be intercepted in the process. So um, here we've got two examples, right? Of what if uh, instead of wanting this like quick pocket, what if this is turned into a big fight along a long exposed front, right? You need to expand the horizontal space of your trench, right? You can instead do something like this where you start with your minimally viable, you put on a little connector trench, right? The point of this is just to turn the trench so that it's facing the new horizontal direction. Um, this trench exists mostly to give you a staircase and a little bit of extra firing position. And then if you want just, you know, quick, dirty, I just need to make this thing wider, um, you got your one for the staircase, one going across, one for the staircase, right? Just simple H's. And you can keep repeating these going on for however long, right? Um, these have some advantages to them. Again, straight trenches are dug the fastest. This connector is the most expensive piece of doing this, and unfortunately, like every time you have to do one of these corners in order to change the direction of your trench, um, you have to dig a connector, and that's a big penalty of time. So try to do this as little as possible, right? That's why the other one was just a straight right angle triangle. Um, this does come with some advantages. This section here can put a bridge on it. Bridge is great for getting the push gun, the light vehicles that we're going to start unlocking soon. Um, it gives a little bit of cover from artillery. However, overall, like this thing is not great for dealing with artillery or infantry, right? Um, if an enemy is standing over here and Jen is standing kind of anywhere along this area, that person can shoot down the entire length. And again, we have an issue of ambiguity. We don't like having like these end pieces be parallel um, with the path along which we want to advance. So if we want to start down here and advance straight up, this side becomes ambiguous in terms of whether or not it's friendly or enemy. If we put barbed wire here and then the enemy occupies this and we try to walk further out in this field, they can shoot us. But if we put sandbags here and the enemy flanks us, which is not that difficult to do, we're going to wind up getting shot up, right? Um, we're going to talk about a solution to this later called tying up these loose ends. Um, but for right now, just be aware that like when you hit a point like this side is weak, um, and you want to have a plan for what you're going to do in order to solve it. Uh, quickly, we're going to talk about like an improvement over those standard H's. This is making a wedge, right? Again, you have staircase trench, but instead of the standard trench connecting them, you do a little wedge shape, right? Going out, going back down. The idea here is if an enemy were standing over here, they wouldn't have a clean shot to Jen if she was standing here. Um, but Jen would be able to maybe shoot back, although given that these are going to be sandbags, Jen would probably have to get to the corner and then shoot back, but it's something. Similarly, if an artillery shell lands here and Jen is standing here, Jen is actually probably safe from that artillery shell. Um, downsides, you can't build a bridge over this. And as noted before, these go up really fast, these go up fairly slowly, so this is a fairly expensive trench to dig. The one other upshot that I don't have listed here, um, the straight trench requires 3 sandbags along the back to secure it. These only require 1 apiece. So if you're light on sandbags and you got a lot of manpower, maybe you can dig these things out real quick and then throw down some sandbags to get like a stronger defensive position. Um, there's also a little bit of an advantage where like the fact that it varies the distances at which you'll fire, where like this is further out, this is further out, this is further back, it can make it harder for the enemy to judge whether or not you're going to be able to hit them. So troops who are trying to stand like right outside of your weapon range might have a little bit of a harder time. It's also a little bit easier to hide in it. Like, you know, if you hide over here, troops from this side can't see you as easily. If you hide over here, troops from that side can't see you. Whereas before, like with a flat one, a little bit easier to hide, maybe from like head on, but from like soldiers out on the side, they might have been able to see you more easily from either side. Okay, so let's talk about tying off the trenches. This is a little bit of a bad example because I just ran out of space. This field wasn't big enough for me to do like a full H and then come down and do this, which is something to think about. Um, And so here, this trench is not what we want because we've only got 1 staircase all the way over here. So any soldier over here who gets caught has to run a considerable distance down a straight hallway, and then down another hallway exposed to the enemy flank in order to get out. Um, but the idea is essentially uh, we're going to do vertical trenches down and then a hexagonal trench. Ideally, if you wanted to, like, let's say this was the right hand side of an H. So you have a line, the connector, or the horizontal one between them, another line, right? You'd want to do another um, another one here just for the staircase on the end, one straight down, and then this octagon, right? So imagine that like if we were to do this correctly, there'd be a horizontal one here, a vertical one here, a horizontal one here, a vertical one here, and then that's that's your H pattern advancing this way, right? The reason why you'd want that is just it gives you more of like a line in case of flanking, because that's mostly what this is about, is stopping enemies from flanking. Um, these octagons are pretty nice for preventing flanking, because like it's going to take us 4 sandbags, but we can go one, two, three, and we can even block off this one here, this one that would give them a lot of vision towards where we're going to be coming from. And yet, we can still have more protected fire if we barbed wire these 3 over on this side. We can have more range of fire into the enemies who might try and flank around us. Plus, by dropping it down vertically, we extend the amount of distance that the enemy has to run in order to get around the trench, right? This will always come with a downside of you're just going to have less staircases when you tie them off. Um, I would just say, like accept that like even if you did like the bar here, this one, and then this one, you only have 1 staircase instead of 2. It's not as ideal. It's a little bit of a suicide position, but like you generally speaking aren't going to hang out over here. This is like, oh, we heard someone's coming this way, or we saw someone, we're going to move over here to stop them, and then we're going to get out of here because there really shouldn't be that much fighting down in this pit, right? Okay, so that's all of the trenches that I have for you, right? to remember. We're going to do a quick recap. You want minimally viable trenches, rifle distance apart, going down the road, alternating what side they're going to be on, right? Um, Once you have those, you're going to dig a second trench, right? Perpendicular on the end of them, and then leave it at that, right? If you are under, if you're fighting a harder battle, if you're stuck in this position, if you're getting flanked, that's when you start thinking about using these other tools, right? But like I'm saying here, dig narrow, dig deep, dig fast. Fast is the name of the game, right? Combat is going to move way faster than you can dig. So you want to make sure that you dig as many trenches, cover as much of the road in your trenches and not the enemy's, right? Because you'll notice the trenches like are not reversible. The enemy coming from their side, they can't just flip that thing around. Even if they get into it, they can't undo your stuff and make it work for them, right? Um, and so it's important that like as much of the road be covered in your friendly trenches as possible. The reason why I'm saying stop at two pieces, one is pretty good, two's a lot better in terms of providing you with a fighting position against enemies ahead of you. Um, but stop there unless you, like I said, are stalemated because you don't want to waste time shoring up this one position that you're never going to fight over, right? It would be so much better to um, have trenches and trench control extend way down the road as opposed to having this one fortified position and then a massive no man's land, or worse, a massive area that the enemy can gobble up with their trenches, right? You want to get in first. The most critical point to control is right by the road. You want to secure as many of those points to start off with as possible, right? Um, this idea of digging narrow is the horizontal width of the trench, right? You want to dig them as narrow as you can. The reason for this is, if the road is over here and your trench is extending like a mile out this way, soldiers have to get into the trench and then run that whole distance before they can do anything at the far end, meaning that that far end is very likely to have no soldiers in it at all and to just get bypassed, right? And it's not worth having dug out there. Um, Digging deep, right, is about that like we have the trench go out, we're having to go over, and then we're gonna go down this way, and maybe we even repeat some H's going down this way before we finally tie it off, right? The further down we go, the deeper the trench is. You're gonna find that at a certain point, it's just not practical to keep digging that trench any deeper, um, and that's totally fine, right? Uh, the point of this is like the deeper you dig it, the harder it is for the enemy to get around it. But remember, fast is king. If you're not suffering from that many flank attacks, don't bother digging it all that deep, right? Um, if you are not stuck in an area and you have an opportunity to gobble up more territory, don't bother digging deep. Dig fast, right? This is kind of like, unfortunately, presented in the reverse order of what you want. You want it to be fast first, then deep, and then narrow. Um, but keep those things in mind, right? I've showed you how to do these things. There are some points where you have the option of how far you're going to go with it. Um, and, you know, here's kind of the narrow is king, deep is king, but get them down first. Um, and then lastly, I just want to give you guys uh, some encouragement before you start doing this, right? Like I said earlier, um, building a trench is pretty slow. And the rate at which the battle can oscillate between you're winning or you're losing, between whether you hold a piece of ground or you lose it, that can be very quick. It is entirely possible that you will be digging maybe your third, your fourth trench, right? And your troops just rolled the enemy, went straight down the road and captured the next town. This is going to feel discouraging, right? You just spent maybe the last half hour digging four trenches that are never going to see combat, and your team won the battle without you, right? Um, and what I want to encourage you by saying is trenches are never dug in the hopes that they get used. If you dig 4 trenches, right, down the road, and your team just sweeps the next town, your team's winning. That's ideal, right? We don't want to wish that our team lost and was pushed back and had to rely on the trenches. It is optimal if the team does not need our trenches. That said, every now and then, your troops are advancing, you're digging your trenches, they do get pushed back onto your trenches, and your trenches turn the tide of that push, let your guys rally behind them, and let you wind up carrying the day. That can happen, but it's not going to be very often. Usually, the battles that trenches wind up winning are long, they're very protracted, and you may not wind up seeing the success in the long run. So, in terms of like, you know, it's discouraging for the fight to end without you, it's slow work, and you may not always feel like the hero. What I want to do is shift the way that you kind of evaluate your success at trenching away from these big swings and towards just a diligence, right? There is, this is something that kind of exists among builders. There is a diligence among builders where when a town gets captured, the first thing they do is they start throwing up defenses. They start digging bunkers. They start putting out little AI turrets, right? They start planning for what are they going to do once they manage to get enough bunker tech to start putting up AT, right? Even though the town might flip back and be destroyed in the next half hour or the next day, right? They may have to recapture that town tomorrow, but it is the diligence of securing the town and securing every single town that makes sure that you can hold on to something, right? And for us, it's kind of the same thing. The diligence in the work is what matters. Putting down those trenches, going down the road. Maybe they're not going to get used, but if they're needed, they are going to make a world of difference, right? And that incremental progress of making sure that we're not going to suffer attrition, making sure we can get a little bit further down the road before we have to start worrying, making sure that there's a little bit less territory that the enemy can control, right? You want as much as possible to have that diligent, slow, methodical progress of improving the odds of victory. That should be the metric of success for you, right? So don't dig in order to save the day. Dig so that somebody, maybe long after you log off, is able to be safe in your trench. Dig in case we do need you. All right, sorry, I'm back. So dig against, right, the possibility that you guys do get thrown back. Um, and this idea of digging so the world is better, dig so that the roads are just protected for your troops. Dig so that more of the area is covered in friendly structures that are going to help you than enemy structures, right? It may only feel like a small thing, but like having just a little bit of an advantage on this terrain is going to wind up adding up, and doing this consistently whenever you're online, whenever you're able to, making these trenches, pushing your soldiers forward will kind of add up over time in the same way that like contributing more scrap and making B mats winds up winning wars just because having more material means you do better, right? And lastly, right, make sure that you're doing it right every time. I've already covered, right? Don't dig a trench and then go and get the sandbags. Have the sandbags there. Have them in a storage box. Make sure that you're maintaining the watchtowers. Make sure that you have radios with you. Make sure you have sandbags, right? Do it right every time. Don't take shortcuts. Don't give up, right? It's our persistence and our diligence that are going to wind up making the big difference in these fights. And with that, good luck, everyone. Uh, Send pics if you have a success, and I will see you out there.